The woman stumbled into Watsonville, Texas, just as the sun began its descent behind the dusty horizon. Her torn dress barely clinging to her shoulders, and her feet bloodied from miles of walking through unforgiving terrain. Jackson Reeves was mending fence posts on the eastern edge of his property when he spotted her, a figure that seemed to materialize from the heat waves rising off the desert floor. At first he thought she might be a mirage, something his tired eyes conjured after a long day's work under the merciless July sun of 1882. But as she drew closer, stumbling over rocks and sage brush, he realized with a jolt that she was real and in desperate need of help. He dropped his tools and ran toward her, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each stride. She collapsed just as he reached her, and he caught her before she hit the ground. Her skin was burning with fever, her lips cracked and bleeding from dehydration. The dress she wore, once perhaps a fine garment of blue calico, was torn in multiple places, exposing scratches and bruises on her pale skin. Her auburn hair hung in matted tangles down her back, filled with thorns and debris. "Easy now," Jackson said, his voice gentle despite his alarm. "I have got you." Her eyes fluttered open for just a moment, revealing irises the color of honey before closing again. She was barely conscious, her breathing shallow and rapid. Without hesitation, Jackson shrugged out of his heavy coat despite the heat and wrapped it around her trembling form, covering her torn dress and offering what protection he could. She was light in his arms as he lifted her, much too light, and he could feel every bone in her back as he held her against his chest. The walk back to his ranch house felt longer than it ever had before. Jackson kept glancing down at her face, watching for any sign that she might wake or, God forbid, stop breathing altogether. Her head lolled against his shoulder, and he could feel the fever radiating through his coat. Whatever had happened to her, wherever she had come from, she needed immediate care. His ranch house was modest but well-maintained, a simple wooden structure with a wide porch that he had built himself over the past 5 years. He had come to Texas with nothing but determination and a small inheritance from his father, and he had turned this patch of difficult land into something productive. His cattle were healthy, his horses were strong, and he had earned the respect of his neighbors through honest work and fair dealing. But he lived alone, and as he kicked open the door to his home, he wished desperately that he had someone, anyone, who could help him care for this mysterious woman. He laid her on his bed, the only real bed in the house, and immediately began trying to cool her fever. He pumped water from the well in his kitchen and soaked clean cloths, laying them on her forehead and wrists. She moaned softly but did not wake. Her breathing remained rapid and shallow, and Jackson felt a tight knot of fear in his chest. He had seen fever take strong men before, and this woman looked like she had been through an ordeal that would have killed most people already. For hours, he worked to bring down her fever, changing the cloths, trying to get small amounts of water between her cracked lips, monitoring her pulse. His coat remained wrapped around her, and he covered her with his best quilt as well, knowing that fever patients often felt cold despite burning up. Night fell completely, and Jackson lit every lamp in the house, unwilling to let darkness hide any change in her condition. It was near midnight when her eyes finally opened fully. She stared up at the rough wooden ceiling for a long moment before her gaze found his face. Jackson was sitting in a chair he had pulled up beside the bed, exhausted but too worried to sleep. "Where am I?" Her voice was barely a whisper, raw and painful sounding. "My ranch just outside Watsonville, Texas," Jackson replied, leaning forward. "You are safe here. What is your name?" She closed her eyes again, and for a moment he thought she had lost consciousness, but then she spoke. "Margaret." Margaret Wright. I am Jackson Reeves. You walked onto my property this evening in bad shape. Can you tell me what happened to you? Margaret's eyes filled with tears that spilled down her temples into her hair. The stage. We were attacked 2 days ago, maybe 3. I lost track of time. They killed the driver and the guard, took everything. I ran into the desert, I just kept running. Jackson felt anger kindle in his chest. Stage robberies were becoming more common in this part of Texas, and the law was spread too thin to do much about it. Did they hurt you? They tried. That is why I ran. I just kept running even after I could not see them anymore. I was so afraid they would follow. Her voice broke and more tears came. I do not know how far I walked. Everything started to blur together. You are safe now, Jackson said firmly. No one is going to hurt you here, I promise you that. She looked at him then, really looked at him, taking in his weathered face, his dark hair that needed cutting, his blue eyes that held genuine concern. Why are you helping me? You do not know me. Because it is the right thing to do, Jackson said simply. Now, you need to drink some water and try to eat something if you can. You are severely dehydrated, and that fever needs to break. Over the next few days, Jackson tended to Margaret with a care that surprised even himself. He made her broth from beef bones and vegetables, helped her sip water even when she protested she could not drink any more, and changed the dressings on her wounded feet with gentle hands. His coat remained within her reach, something she clutched during the worst of her fever dreams, and Jackson did not ask for it back. Margaret's fever finally broke on the 3rd day. She woke in the early morning to find Jackson asleep in the chair beside the bed, his head tilted back at an angle that looked profoundly uncomfortable, his hand still resting on the edge of the mattress, as if he had fallen asleep while checking her pulse. She studied him in the soft dawn light filtering through the window. He had a strong jaw, covered now with several days' growth of beard, and his face bore the lines of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. His hands were calloused and scarred from hard work, but they had been infinitely gentle when treating her injuries. She tried to sit up and gasped at the stiffness in her body. The sound woke Jackson immediately, and he lurched forward in the chair. "Easy," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "You have been through hell, take it slow." "I feel like I was trampled by a herd of cattle," Margaret admitted, managing to prop herself up on the pillows. "But the fever is gone." Relief washed over Jackson's face. "Thank God. I was starting to worry it would not break. How do you feel otherwise?" "Weak, sore, but alive, thanks to you." She looked down at herself, realizing she was wearing a man's shirt that was far too large for her, and she was clean. Her face flushed. "Did you?" "I just washed your face and hands and feet," Jackson said quickly, his own face reddening. "I would not have been improper. Your dress is over there, cleaned and mended as best I could. I am not much of a seamstress, but it is decent now." Margaret looked to where he pointed and saw her dress hanging on a peg near the window, the tiers carefully stitched, the fabric cleaned of blood and dust. Something in her chest tightened at the sight. This stranger had not only saved her life but had shown her every consideration and respect. "I do not know how to thank you," she said softly. "You do not need to thank me. I am just glad you are going to be all right." Jackson stood and stretched, his joints popping audibly. "I will make some breakfast. Real food this time, not just broth. You need to build your strength back." "Wait," Margaret said as he turned toward the door. "I need to tell someone what happened. The stage company, the law, those men might attack again." "I will ride into town today and report it to the sheriff," Jackson assured her. "You focus on recovering. You are in no shape to go anywhere yet." Margaret wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. Just sitting up had exhausted her. She nodded reluctantly and watched him leave the room. Once she was alone, she looked around more carefully. The room was simple but clean, with sturdy furniture and none of the decorative touches a woman might add. A single window looked out over land that stretched to the horizon, brown and harsh but with a stark beauty to it. She could see cattle in the distance, dark shapes against the pale earth. Jackson returned with a plate of eggs and bacon, along with fresh bread that he admitted buying from a neighbor since his own baking skills were limited. Margaret ate slowly, her stomach protesting at first, but then accepting the food gratefully. Jackson sat across from her, drinking coffee and answering her questions about the ranch, the town, and the area. "I have been here 5 years," he told her. "Bought this land when it was nothing but scrub and rattlesnakes. Built the house myself, started with just a dozen head of cattle. Now I have got nearly 100 and I am making a decent living. It is hard work, but it is mine." "Do you have family?" Margaret asked. Jackson shook his head. "My parents died back in Missouri when I was 20. Had a sister, but she married and moved to California. We write occasionally, but I have not seen her in years. What about you? Where were you heading when the stage was attacked?" Margaret's face clouded. "I was coming from St. Louis. My parents died of cholera last winter, both of them within a week of each other. They left debts, so many debts. The house was sold to pay them off. I had a position arranged here in Texas, in Dallas, as a governess for a family. Everything I owned was in my trunk on that stage." "I am sorry," Jackson said quietly. "That is a hard loss." "I had already mourned them," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes. "But now I have nothing. No possessions, no money, no position waiting for me because I will be weeks late if I ever arrive at all. I do not even know what I am going to do." "You are going to stay here until you are fully recovered," Jackson said firmly. "After that, we will figure out the rest, but you are not going to worry about it today." Margaret felt tears threatening again. "You have already done so much. I cannot impose on you further." "It is not an imposition. I could use the company, to be honest. It gets lonely out here." Jackson offered her a small smile. "Besides, you are in no condition to go anywhere. Your feet alone need another week before you should be walking on them properly." He was right, and Margaret knew it. She nodded slowly. "Then I will help however I can. I am a hard worker, I promise you. Once I am stronger, I can cook and clean, earn my keep." "We will work something out," Jackson agreed. "For now, just rest." He took the empty plate and left her alone. Margaret lay back on the pillows, feeling overwhelmed by everything that had happened. Just days ago, she had been on a stage heading toward what she hoped would be a new start. Now she was in a stranger's bed, wearing his shirt, wrapped in his coat, alive only because he had found her and cared for her. She looked at the coat, running her fingers over the worn leather. It smelled like him, like horses and leather and something indefinably masculine. It had become a source of comfort during her fever, and she was reluctant to let it go even now. Jackson rode into Watsonville that afternoon, leaving Margaret with strict instructions to rest. The town was small, just a main street with a handful of businesses and houses scattered around. The sheriff's office was a squat adobe building near the center of town, and Jackson found Sheriff Cole Warner inside, working on paperwork. "Jackson," Cole greeted him, looking up from his desk. "What brings you in?" Jackson explained about finding Margaret, about the stage attack, and everything she had told him. Cole's expression grew grim as he listened. "That is the third stage hit in 2 months, Cole said, standing and walking to a map on the wall. "They are getting bolder." Did she give any description of the attackers? She was not coherent enough for details yet, but I can bring her in when she is stronger. "Do that. In the meantime, I will send word to the stage company and see if we can organize a posse to search the area where it happened. Though if it was 2 or 3 days ago, those bandits are long gone by now." Cole studied Jackson for a moment. How is she doing? Must have been rough, alone in the desert that long. She will recover. She is strong. Jackson found himself feeling defensive of Margaret, though he was not sure why. You bringing her into town once she is better? Have not discussed it yet. She lost everything in the attack, including a position she had waiting in Dallas. She has got nowhere to go at the moment. Cole raised his eyebrows. So she is staying with you? Just until she recovers and figures out what she wants to do, Jackson said, hearing how defensive he sounded and not caring. None of my business, Cole said, raising his hands. Just be careful, Jackson. Pretty woman, isolated ranch, people will talk. Let them talk. I am not going to throw her out when she has got nowhere to go and no money. Cole nodded slowly. You are a good man, Jackson. Just watch yourself. Jackson left the sheriff's office feeling irritated, though he knew Cole was just looking out for him. The truth was, he had not thought much about what people might say. He had just acted on instinct when he found Margaret, and he would do the same thing again. But Cole was right that the situation was delicate. A single man and a single woman living together, even temporarily, would cause gossip in a town as small as Watsonville. He stopped at the general store on his way out of town, buying fabric for a dress, thread, needles, and various other supplies he thought Margaret might need. The storekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, gave him curious looks as he made his purchases, but was too polite to ask questions directly. Jackson knew the gossip would spread regardless. When he returned to the ranch, he found Margaret sitting on the porch, still wearing his shirt but with a quilt wrapped around her legs. She had brushed her hair, and it hung in damp waves over her shoulders, catching the late afternoon light. You should be resting, Jackson said, dismounting and tying his horse to the rail. I have been resting for 3 days. I needed to see the sky to feel the air. Margaret smiled at him, and Jackson felt something shift in his chest. She was beautiful, he realized suddenly. He had been so focused on keeping her alive that he had not really noticed. But now, with color returning to her cheeks and life back in her eyes, he could see it clearly. Did you speak with the sheriff? Jackson sat down on the porch steps and told her about his conversation with Cole, leaving out the part about people talking. He handed her the packages from the store. I got you some things. I am not sure what all you need, but I tried to think of the basics. There is fabric in there for a dress. If you tell me your measurements, Mrs. Patterson in town said she would be happy to make it up for you. Margaret opened the packages, her eyes widening. This is too much. I cannot pay you back. I am not asking you to. Consider it a gift. Jackson looked out at the horizon, finding it easier than meeting her eyes. You lost everything, Margaret. Let me help you start over. Why? The word was soft, not challenging, just genuinely curious. Why are you being so kind to me? Jackson thought about it for a moment. When I came to Texas, I had almost nothing. People helped me get started, gave me advice, extended credit when I needed it, helped me build this house. I would not have made it without them. Maybe I am just paying that kindness forward. I think you are just a good man, Margaret said quietly. Jackson felt heat rise to his face and changed the subject. How are your feet feeling? Better. Still sore, but healing. Margaret pulled the quilt aside slightly to show him. The wounds were indeed healing, the angry red fading to pink. Good. That is good. Jackson stood. I need to see to the horses and check on the cattle. Will you be all right out here? Yes. It feels good to be outside. Jackson left her there and went about his evening chores, but he found his thoughts returning to her again and again. There was something about Margaret, something beyond her beauty that drew him. She had been through something traumatic but had not fallen apart. She was strong, determined, and there was a kindness in her eyes despite what she had suffered. He reminded himself that she would be leaving once she recovered, heading to Dallas or back to St. Louis, or wherever she decided to go. He should not let himself think of her as anything other than someone he was helping temporarily. But that night, as he lay on the couch in the main room, having given her his bed, he found himself staring at the ceiling and thinking about the sound of her voice, the way she smiled, the strength it must have taken to survive what she had been through. He told himself firmly that he was being foolish, that she deserved better than a rancher with a small spread and a simple house, that she had her whole life ahead of her and should not be tied down to the Texas wilderness. It did not stop him from thinking about her. Over the following week, Margaret grew stronger each day. She insisted on helping around the house despite Jackson's protests, and he came in from working each evening to find the place cleaner than it had been in years, dinner waiting, and Margaret moving around the kitchen with increasing ease. She proved to be an excellent cook, making meals that were far better than his usual simple fare. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" Jackson asked one evening, savoring a stew that had vegetables he had not even known he had. "My mother taught me. She was very particular about proper cooking." Margaret smiled, but there was sadness in it. "She had ambitions for me, wanted me to marry well, to have a better life than they had. She would probably be horrified to see me here." "Why?" Jackson felt oddly hurt by the comment. "Not because of you," Margaret said quickly, seeing his expression. "Just because I am supposed to be in a city in a proper situation, not alone with a bachelor on an isolated ranch." She worried about propriety. "Are you worried about it?" Margaret considered the question seriously. "A few weeks ago I would have been, but I nearly died out there in the desert. Being alive seems more important than what people might think, and you have been nothing but respectful. Still, people will talk, already starting to in town, I expect." "Let them," Margaret said with a shrug that seemed far more confident than she probably felt. "I have nowhere else to go anyway. You could still go to Dallas, find another position. Maybe, or maybe I could stay here." The words hung in the air between them. Jackson looked at her, sitting across his small table, wearing the new dress that Mrs. Patterson had made up, her hair pulled back in a simple style, and he wanted nothing more than for her to stay. But he knew he should not ask it, should not trap her in this small life when she could have so much more. "You should not decide that now," Jackson said carefully. "You are still recovering. Once you are fully healed, once you have had time to think about what you really want, then you can decide." Margaret looked like she wanted to argue but nodded instead. "Perhaps you are right." 2 weeks after Margaret arrived, Jackson took her into town for the first time. She needed to speak with the sheriff and give her statement about the stage attack, and she wanted to thank Mrs. Patterson for the dress. Jackson hitched up his small wagon, knowing the ride on horseback would still be too difficult for her. Watsonville was busier than when Jackson had come in alone. It was Saturday, and people had come from the surrounding ranches to do their shopping and socializing. Jackson felt the eyes on them as he helped Margaret down from the wagon, felt the whispers start. He kept his expression neutral and offered Margaret his arm, which she took gratefully. Sheriff Cole was professional and kind as he took Margaret's statement. She described the attack as best she could, though she admitted she had not gotten a good look at the attackers' faces. They had worn bandanas over their faces, and she had been too focused on escaping to pay attention to details. Cole assured her that he would continue investigating and that she had been lucky to escape with her life. "Where are you staying?" Cole asked, though Jackson suspected he already knew the answer. "With Mr. Reeves," Margaret said steadily. "He saved my life and has been kind enough to give me shelter while I recover and decide what to do next." "I see." Cole glanced at Jackson. "Well, if you need anything, Miss Wright, you just let me know." They left the sheriff's office and walked down the main street toward the general store. Jackson could feel people staring, could hear the whispers getting louder. He set his jaw and kept walking, but Margaret's hand tightened on his arm. "Everyone is looking at us," she murmured. "Let them look. You have done nothing wrong. Inside the general store, Mrs. Patterson greeted them warmly, admiring how well the dress fit Margaret and waving away her thanks. But several other women in the store were less welcoming. Jackson heard one of them, Mrs. Crenshaw, the wife of a neighboring rancher, say in a voice clearly meant to carry, "Living alone with a man. It is shameful. No respectable woman would." Margaret's face flushed, but she held her head high. Jackson felt anger surge through him. "Mrs. Crenshaw," he said, turning to face the woman directly. "Miss Wright survived being attacked, lost everything she owned, and walked through the desert for days. I found her nearly dead and gave her shelter. If you find that shameful, then I am ashamed to call you a neighbor." Mrs. Crenshaw's face turned red and she sputtered, but Jackson had already turned away, guiding Margaret toward the door. They left the store in tense silence. Outside, Margaret pulled away from him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "This is not fair to you. People will talk about you too." "I do not care what they say about me. But you have to live here, do business with these people. I am ruining your reputation." Jackson took her hands in his, not caring who saw. "Margaret, you have not ruined anything. Some people are small-minded and cruel. That is not your fault. I should go. Find somewhere else to stay. I could take a job in town, perhaps board with someone." "Is that what you want?" Jackson found his heart was pounding. The thought of her leaving, of not seeing her every day, filled him with an unexpected sense of loss. "No," Margaret admitted quietly. "But I do not want to cause you trouble." "Then stay. Please." They stood there in the middle of the street, hands clasped, looking at each other. Jackson saw the moment something shifted in Margaret's expression, saw her eyes soften and her lips part slightly. He wanted desperately to kiss her, but knew this was neither the time nor the place. "We should go," he said reluctantly, releasing her hands. "We have a long ride back." The trip back to the ranch was quiet, both of them lost in thought. Jackson kept replaying the moment in the street, the way she had looked at him, the way his heart had raced. He was falling for her, he realized. Maybe had already fallen. The thought terrified him. He had never been good with women, had always been too focused on building his ranch to think much about courting. And Margaret deserved proper courting, deserved romance and poetry and everything he did not know how to give. That evening, after dinner, they sat on the porch watching the sunset. It had become something of a ritual over the past week, both of them drawn to the quiet beauty of the Texas sky as day turned to night. "I am sorry about what happened in town," Jackson said finally. "You have nothing to apologize for. You defended me. No one has ever done that before." "Not even your parents," Margaret shook her head. "They loved me, but they were not fighters. They believed in enduring, in accepting what came. You are different. I just cannot stand by and watch people be cruel. It is more than that. You are kind and strong and good. Any woman would be lucky to have you." Jackson turned to look at her, his heart hammering. "Margaret." "I am staying," she said before he could continue. "I do not care what people say. I want to stay here with you." "You should not decide that because you feel obligated or because you have nowhere else to go. That is not why." Margaret stood and moved to stand in front of him. "I am staying because I want to, because I feel safe here. Because when I think about leaving, about never seeing you again, I cannot bear it." Jackson stood as well, his hands reaching for hers automatically. "You have only been here 2 weeks. You barely know me. I know enough. I know you saved my life. I know you have been kind and respectful and patient. I know that when you look at me, I feel something I have never felt before." "What do you feel?" Jackson asked, his voice rough. "Like I am home." Jackson closed the distance between them, his hands coming up to cup her face. "I am falling in love with you, Margaret Wright. I tried not to. I told myself you deserved better, but I cannot seem to help it." "Then do not help it," Margaret whispered, "because I am falling in love with you too, Jackson Reeves." He kissed her then, soft and gentle at first, then deeper as she pressed against him. She tasted like the coffee they had drunk with dinner, and something uniquely her. Her hands came up to rest on his chest, and he could feel her heart beating as fast as his own. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Jackson rested his forehead against hers. "I want to do this right. I want to court you properly." "We are a bit past that, do not you think?" Margaret said with a soft laugh. "Maybe, but I still want to try. You deserve that much." "What I deserve is you," Margaret said firmly. "But if you want to court me, then court me. Just do not make me wait too long." They stayed on the porch until full dark, talking about everything and nothing, making plans for the future. Jackson told her about his dreams for the ranch, about wanting to expand his herd, maybe build a bigger house someday. Margaret told him about her childhood in St. Louis, about books she loved and places she wanted to see. But mostly, they talked about building a life together, here on this harsh but beautiful land. Over the next few months, Jackson courted Margaret with a determination that surprised even himself. He brought her wildflowers from the far corners of his property, took her on rides to show her the extent of his land, taught her to ride a horse properly. He took her into town every Saturday, ignoring the gossip and the stares, making sure people saw that he was treating her with complete respect and propriety. Slowly, the town began to come around. Mrs. Patterson became an ally, speaking well of Margaret to anyone who would listen. Even Sheriff Cole admitted that Jackson was doing right by her. Only a few stubborn holdouts like Mrs. Crenshaw continued to disapprove, but Jackson found he cared less and less what they thought. Margaret bloomed in the Texas sunshine. The pale, fever-racked woman Jackson had found was replaced by someone vibrant and strong. She took over most of the household duties, managed the small vegetable garden Jackson had never had time to properly maintain, and even started learning about cattle ranching, asking intelligent questions that showed she was genuinely interested in his work. 4 months after she arrived, Jackson rode into town and bought a ring. It was simple, a small gold band with a tiny diamond, all he could afford. But when he showed it to Mrs. Patterson, the older woman teared up and told him it was perfect. He proposed on the porch at sunset, in the place where they had first acknowledged their feelings for each other. He got down on one knee, feeling awkward and nervous, holding out the ring with a hand that shook slightly. "Margaret Wright, I know I am just a rancher with a small spread in a simple house. I cannot offer you wealth or city life or any of the things you might have had. But I can offer you my heart, my protection, and my name. Will you marry me?" Margaret's face was radiant with joy. "Yes. Yes, Jackson Reeves, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger and she pulled him to his feet, kissing him thoroughly. "I love you," she said against his lips. "I have never been happier than I am here with you." They were married a month later in the small church in Watsonville. It was a simple ceremony, with Sheriff Cole standing up as Jackson's best man and Mrs. Patterson standing with Margaret. Most of the town turned out, and if there were still some disapproving looks, they were drowned out by genuine well-wishes. Margaret wore a new dress of ivory silk that Jackson had insisted on buying her, and she carried a bouquet of wildflowers. Jackson wore his best suit, the one he had bought when he first came to Texas, and had worn perhaps 3 times since. He could not take his eyes off Margaret as she walked down the aisle toward him. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Thomas began, and Jackson felt his heart swell with happiness. When it came time for the vows, Jackson spoke clearly and firmly. I, Jackson Reeves, take you, Margaret Wright, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to love you, protect you, and stand by you for all the days of my life. Margaret's voice was steady despite the tears streaming down her face. I, Margaret Wright, take you, Jackson Reeves, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to love you, support you, and stand by you for all the days of my life. I now pronounce you husband and wife, Reverend Thomas said with a smile. You may kiss your bride. Jackson did, and the small church erupted in applause. As they walked back down the aisle together, hand in hand, Jackson felt like the luckiest man alive. This woman, this incredible, strong, beautiful woman, was his wife. She had come to him with nothing, and he had given her his coat, his name, and his heart, and she had given him everything in return. The reception was held at the ranch, with neighbors bringing food and drink, musicians providing entertainment. It was nothing fancy, but it was joyful. Even Mrs. Crenshaw attended, though she still looked somewhat disapproving. Margaret handled it with grace, thanking everyone for coming and winning over even the most skeptical with her warmth and genuine kindness. As the sun set and guests began to leave, Jackson and Margaret stood on the porch, watching the sky turn brilliant shades of orange and red. Mrs. Reeves, Jackson said, testing out the name. How does it feel? Perfect, Margaret replied, leaning into him. Everything about this feels perfect. Even the gossip and the harsh land and the simple life, especially those things, because they are part of you, part of us. Margaret turned to look up at him. I lost everything, Jackson. My parents, my home, every possession I owned. I thought my life was over. But really, it was just beginning. Jackson kissed her softly. Come on, Mrs. Reeves, let us go inside. Their first year of marriage was both difficult and wonderful. The work of running a ranch was hard, especially when drought hit in late summer. They lost some cattle and money was tight. But they faced it together. Margaret working alongside Jackson, learning to rope and brand, to ride herd and mend fences. She proved to be tougher than anyone had expected, including herself. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, exhausted but content, and talk about their day. Margaret would read to Jackson from books she borrowed from the small lending library in town, and Jackson would tell her stories about his childhood in Missouri, about his parents and sister, about the adventures that had brought him to Texas. Winter came, and with it, relief from the drought. Rain soaked the parched earth, and the ranch began to recover. Jackson's herd had been reduced, but those that remained were healthy, and come spring, there would be calves to rebuild their numbers. It was during the cold winter months that Margaret realized she was pregnant. She told Jackson one evening after dinner, watching his face carefully for his reaction. A baby. Jackson's voice was full of wonder. We are going to have a baby. Yes, sometime in early summer, I think. Jackson swept her into his arms, spinning her around despite her laughing protests that he should be careful. This is wonderful. This is the best news. We are going to be parents. Are you happy? Margaret asked, though she could see the answer on his face. Happy does not begin to cover it. Jackson set her down gently, his hands going to her still flat stomach. A son or daughter, our child. Margaret, I love you so much. I love you too. I am scared, though. What if I am not a good mother? What if something goes wrong? You will be an amazing mother. And nothing is going to go wrong. We will get through this together, like we get through everything. Jackson was fiercely protective during Margaret's pregnancy. He insisted she stop doing the heavier ranch work, bringing in a young man from town to help with the daily chores. Margaret protested at first, but had to admit that, as her belly grew, she was grateful for the help. Mrs. Patterson became a frequent visitor, bringing baby clothes she had sewn and offering advice. Even Mrs. Crenshaw thawed somewhat, stopping by one day with a cradle that her own children had used, admitting gruffly that every baby needed a proper place to sleep. "Thank you," Margaret said, genuinely touched. "This is very kind of you." "Well," Mrs. Crenshaw said, looking uncomfortable, "I may have been hasty in my judgment of you. You have proven yourself to be a good wife and a hard worker. I was wrong." It was as close to an apology as Margaret was likely to get, and she accepted it graciously. "I appreciate that. Would you like to stay for tea, Mrs. Crenshaw did, and by the time she left, she and Margaret had made peace. It felt like a weight had been lifted, having the approval of the community that had once judged her so harshly. In June of 1883, after a long and difficult labor, Margaret gave birth to a son. They named him James after Jackson's father. He was healthy and loud, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that would eventually turn the same blue as his father's. Jackson held his son with hands that trembled, his eyes bright with tears. "Hello, James. I am your father. And I promise you, I am going to do everything I can to give you a good life." Margaret watched from the bed, exhausted but elated. "He is perfect. He is, just like his mother." Jackson carefully placed the baby in Margaret's arms and sat on the edge of the bed beside them. "Thank you. Thank you for this, for him, for everything. I should be thanking you. You saved my life, Jackson. You gave me a home, a family, everything I thought I had lost." "We saved each other," Jackson said, kissing her forehead. "Now we have this little one to raise and love." The first months with baby James were exhausting. He was colicky and did not sleep well, and both Jackson and Margaret walked around in a haze of sleeplessness. But there was joy, too, in watching him grow and change and seeing his first smiles, in the way he would calm when Jackson sang to him in his rough, off-key voice. As James grew into a toddler, the ranch prospered. The drought broke completely, and several years of good rainfall meant excellent grazing. Jackson's herd grew substantially, and he was able to hire on permanent help 2 cowboys who lived in the small bunkhouse he built. The house was expanded too, with a proper nursery for James and plans for more rooms in the future. When James was 3, Margaret became pregnant again. This time, she gave birth to twin girls, Emily and Sarah, who inherited their mother's auburn hair and Jackson's stubborn determination. The house that had once seemed so quiet was now full of noise and life and laughter. "How did this happen?" Jackson asked one evening, standing in the doorway of the nursery, watching Margaret rock the twins to sleep while James played quietly with wooden blocks on the floor. "I believe you know how it happened," Margaret said with a tired smile. "I mean all of this life. I was alone for so long, and now look at this. 3 children, a wife I love more than life itself, a home full of joy." "It all started the day you found me," Margaret said. "The day you wrapped me in your coat and gave me shelter. That was the day my real life began." Jackson crossed the room and kissed her softly, careful not to wake the sleeping babies. "Mine too. I just did not know it yet." The children grew, and with them, the ranch continued to expand. James showed an early aptitude for working with horses, spending hours in the corral with his father, learning to ride almost before he could walk properly. Emily and Sarah were inseparable, getting into mischief together, keeping Margaret constantly on her toes. 2 more children followed over the years, another son named Thomas and a daughter named Catherine. The house was expanded again to accommodate them all, becoming a sprawling structure that bore little resemblance to the simple cabin Jackson had built when he first arrived in Texas. As the years passed, Jackson and Margaret's love only deepened. They still sat on the porch in the evenings when they could steal a moment alone, watching the sunset, talking about their day. They still held hands, still kissed like newlyweds, still looked at each other with wonder that this life was theirs. You ever think about that day?" Jackson asked one evening when the children were all in bed and they had the porch to themselves. "The day you walked onto my property." "Every day," Margaret replied. "I think about how close I came to dying out there, how different my life would be if you had not found me, or if you had been a different kind of man. I think about it too, about how empty my life was before you came. I thought I was content, thought the ranch was enough, but you made me realize what I was missing. A house full of screaming children and endless laundry," Margaret teased. "Love," Jackson said simply. "I was missing love, and you brought so much of it into my life. You and our children and this family we have built together." Margaret leaned her head on his shoulder. "I arrived with nothing but a torn dress. You wrapped me in your coat and your name. You gave me everything. You gave me just as much, more even." Jackson kissed the top of her head. "I love you, Margaret Reeves. I will love you until the day I die and beyond. And I love you, Jackson Reeves, always." The years continued to pass, marked by the growth of their children and the prosperity of the ranch. James grew into a fine young man, eventually taking over much of the day-to-day running of the ranch. He married a neighboring rancher's daughter, a practical young woman named Alice, and they built a house on the far corner of the property, starting their own family. Emily and Sarah both became teachers, opening a small school in Watsonville that served the children of local ranchers and townspeople. They lived in town during the week and came home on weekends, filling the house with stories and laughter. Thomas showed an unexpected talent for business, handling the financial side of the ranch with a skill that neither Jackson nor Margaret possessed. He modernized their operations, found new markets for their cattle, and increased their profits substantially. Catherine, the youngest, had her mother's kind heart and became a nurse, traveling all the way to San Antonio for training before returning to Watsonville to care for the sick and injured in the growing community. As their children grew and built their own lives, Jackson and Margaret found themselves with time they had not had in years. They used it to travel, taking trips to San Antonio and even once to California to visit Jackson's sister. But they always came home to the ranch, to the land that had brought them together. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Jackson surprised Margaret with a new coat. It was finely made, far nicer than the worn leather one he had wrapped around her that first day. "What is this for?" Margaret asked, running her hands over the soft fabric. "I just realized I never gave you back that first coat," Jackson said with a smile. "You kept it for so long, wore it until it fell apart. I thought you deserved a better one." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "I loved that coat. It smelled like you. It made me feel safe. I hope I still make you feel safe. You do, every single day." Margaret kissed him. "Thank you for this. But you know what? I do not think any coat will ever mean as much to me as that first one did, because it was the beginning of everything." Exactly. They stood on the porch in the place where so many important moments of their life together had happened, and held each other as the sun set. The land stretched out before them, still harsh but beautiful, still demanding but rewarding. This was their home, the place where Margaret had arrived broken and Jackson had given her shelter. The place where they had fallen in love, raised their children, and built a life that neither of them could have imagined that first day. As they grew older, their hair turning gray and their steps slowing, Jackson and Margaret remained devoted to each other. They took walks around the property, Jackson pointing out changes, Margaret reminding him of stories from years past. They attended church every Sunday, sat on the porch every evening, and never missed an opportunity to tell each other, and their children, how much they loved each other. Their grandchildren came, a parade of babies and toddlers and eventually teenagers, all of them drawn to the ranch, to the stories of how their grandparents had met, to the love that was still so evident between Jackson and Margaret even after decades of marriage. One evening, when they were both well into their 60s, Jackson and Margaret sat on the porch watching yet another sunset. Their bodies were tired, marked by years of hard work, but their spirits were strong. "You have any regrets?" Jackson asked. "Anything you wish had been different?" Margaret thought about it seriously. "No, not a single one. My life has been exactly what it was meant to be. Even the hard parts, the stage attack, losing your parents, the drought years when we did not know if we would make it, even those parts. Because they led me here to you, to this life. I would not change a thing." Jackson squeezed her hand. "I feel the same way. Every moment, good and bad, was worth it to have you by my side." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sky turn from orange to purple to the deep blue of early night. Stars began to appear, brilliant in the clear Texas sky. "Thank you," Margaret said softly. "For what? For finding me. For saving me, for loving me, for giving me this beautiful life." "Thank you for letting me," Jackson replied. "For choosing to stay, for choosing me. I would choose you again, every single time." As night fell completely, they went inside, Jackson helping Margaret up from her chair with the same gentleness he had shown when he first found her. They moved through their house, the house that had grown with their family, past rooms full of memories and love. In their bedroom, they prepared for sleep with the ease of long practice. Jackson helped Margaret with her buttons, and she helped him with his boots. They lay down together in the bed they had shared for decades, and Margaret curled into Jackson's side as naturally as breathing. "I love you," Jackson murmured into her hair. "I love you too," Margaret replied. "Always and forever." They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms. Two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built a life and a love that would endure long after they were gone. The story of how Margaret had arrived with nothing but a torn dress, and how Jackson had wrapped her in his coat and his name, would be told to their grandchildren and great-grandchildren, a testament to the power of kindness, compassion, and love. Years later, when both Jackson and Margaret had passed peacefully in their sleep within months of each other, their children gathered at the ranch for the memorial service. They stood on the porch, that sacred space where so much of their parents' love story had unfolded, and shared memories. James told the story of how his father had found his mother, how he had saved her life and given her shelter. Emily and Sarah talked about the love they had witnessed growing up, how their parents never stopped courting each other, never stopped showing affection. Thomas spoke of the lessons his father had taught him about hard work and integrity. Catherine shared memories of her mother's kindness and compassion. The old coat, carefully preserved by Margaret for years despite its worn condition, was brought out. It was fragile now, the leather cracked and faded, but it remained a treasured family heirloom. Each of the children and grandchildren touched it reverently, understanding that this simple piece of clothing represented the beginning of their family, the moment when everything changed. As the sun set on that Memorial Day, casting the same golden light that had illuminated so many evenings of Jackson and Margaret's life together, the family stood together and watched. They knew that while their parents were gone, the love story they had created would live on. It was written in the land they had worked, the house they had built, the children they had raised, and the legacy of love they had left behind. The ranch continued to thrive under James's management and later under his children. The house remained full of life and laughter, new generations growing up in the place where Jackson and Margaret had built their dreams. The porch where they had sat so many evenings remained a gathering place, and it was not uncommon for family members to swear they could sometimes feel their presence there, still watching the sunset together, still holding hands, still in love. And in the cemetery in Watsonville, Two headstones stood side by side, marking the final resting place of Jackson Reeves and Margaret Wright Reeves. The inscriptions were simple, just names and dates. But those who knew their story understood that these stones marked something far more significant than just the end of two lives. They marked a love that had transformed both of them, a partnership that had built something lasting, a testament to the truth that sometimes the most extraordinary love stories begin with a simple act of kindness. The legend of how Margaret arrived with nothing but a torn dress, and how Jackson wrapped her in his coat, and his name became part of Watsonville's history. It was told and retold, a reminder that in the harsh landscape of the Wild West, love could not only survive but flourish. That a single moment of compassion could change the course of entire lives. That the greatest treasures were not wealth or status, but the connections we make with others. Decades after their deaths, historians would find letters between Jackson and Margaret, carefully preserved by their descendants. The letters revealed the depth of their love, the challenges they faced, the joy they found in each other. One letter in particular, written by Margaret on their 10th anniversary, captured the essence of their relationship. She wrote, "You found me when I was lost, gave me shelter when I had none, and loved me when I had nothing to offer but a broken spirit and a torn dress. You wrapped me in your coat that first day, and in doing so, you wrapped me in your heart. You gave me your name and made me whole. I love you more with each passing day, and I thank God for leading my stumbling feet to your land." Jackson's reply was equally moving. "You say you had nothing to offer, but you are wrong. You brought me everything. Before you, my house was just a structure. My work was just survival. My life was just passing time. You turned my house into a home, my work into purpose, my life into joy. That torn dress you wore when I found you was more precious to me than any fine garment, because you were in it. You were the treasure I found in the desert, the answer to prayers I did not know how to pray. I love you beyond words, beyond measure, beyond this life." These letters, and dozens more like them, painted a picture of a love that never faded, never diminished, never became routine or boring. Jackson and Margaret chose each other every single day of their lives together. They worked through difficulties, celebrated triumphs, raised children, built a legacy, and through it all, remained each other's greatest love and closest companion. The ranch that Jackson had started with almost nothing became one of the most successful in the region, not because of any single innovation or lucky break, but because it was built on love and partnership. Jackson and Margaret worked together in everything, each bringing their strengths to bear. Where Jackson was strong and practical, Margaret was wise and compassionate. Where she was gentle and patient, he was determined and fierce. Together they were unstoppable. Their children carried forward not just the ranch itself, but the values their parents had instilled in them. They treated workers fairly, helped neighbors in need, welcomed strangers, and built their own marriages on the foundation of love and respect they had witnessed growing up. The Reeves name became synonymous with integrity and kindness throughout Texas. The coat that had started it all was eventually placed in a museum in San Antonio, part of an exhibit on pioneer life in Texas. The placard beside it told the story of Jackson and Margaret, of how a simple act of covering a woman's torn dress with a man's coat had led to one of the great love stories of the American West. Thousands of people passed by it each year, reading the story, looking at the worn leather, and being reminded that love can bloom in the most unexpected places. But perhaps the greatest testament to Jackson and Margaret's love was not found in any museum or historical record. It was found in the way their descendants lived their lives. It was in the great-granddaughter who became a doctor and traveled the world providing medical care to those who had nothing. It was in the great-grandson who started a scholarship fund for orphans, remembering that his great-grandmother had once had nothing and had been given everything. It was in the way the family gathered every year on the anniversary of Jackson and Margaret's first meeting, telling the story again to the youngest generation, ensuring that the legacy of love and kindness continued. The story of how Margaret arrived with nothing but a torn dress, and how Jackson wrapped her in his coat, and his name became more than just family history. It became a reminder that in a world that could be harsh and unforgiving, kindness mattered. That seeing someone in need and choosing to help could change not just their life but your own. That love was not about grand gestures or perfect circumstances, but about choosing each other, day after day, through good times and bad. And so, while Jackson and Margaret had long since passed from this world, their love story lived on. It was told around dinner tables and campfires, written about in books and articles, passed down through generations. It reminded people that even in the wildest places, even in the most difficult circumstances, love could take root and grow into something beautiful and lasting. The porch where they had spent so many evenings remained standing, weathered by time but still sturdy. On quiet evenings when the wind blew just right, some said you could almost hear the echo of their voices, the sound of their laughter, the whisper of words of love spoken decades ago. Whether that was true or simply wishful thinking did not really matter. What mattered was that the love Jackson and Margaret had shared was real, was powerful, was transformative. It had started with a coat wrapped around a torn dress and had grown into something that would never be forgotten. And that, more than anything else, was the truest measure of their love. Not in the material success they achieved or the children they raised, though those things mattered, but in the fact that their story continued to inspire, to move, to remind people of what was truly important. They had lived ordinary lives in many ways, working hard, facing challenges, growing old together. But their love had been extraordinary, and it endured long after they were gone. The sun continued to set over the Texas landscape, painting the sky in brilliant colors just as it had on that first day when Margaret stumbled onto Jackson's property. The land remained harsh and beautiful, demanding and rewarding. And somewhere in the tapestry of time and memory, Jackson and Margaret still sat on that porch, hands clasped, hearts joined, watching the sunset together and knowing that their love would last forever.